Okay, thank you very much, Anders, for that nice introduction. And I also want to thank Madeline Bogda for the invitation to speak on this topic, and also those at the KSLA who facilitated my visit. I'm really happy to be here and to speak with you today. So I, as mentioned, I'm speaking on the challenge of making science and knowledge-based policy recommendations for the global food system. And this is a really important moment to be speaking about this topic. As we all know, the world is currently in the grips of a world food crisis where the number of people facing hunger and undernutrition is on the rise. And the cause of this crisis, as we know most immediately, we're very concerned about the war in Ukraine and how that's disrupted global supply chains. But even before the war, the outbreak of the war almost 1 year ago now, we were already very concerned about how the COVID-19 pandemic was affecting food security and nutrition globally. And at the same time, there was also a big concern about not meeting the not meeting the Sustainable Development Goal number 2 to end hunger and promote sustainable food security, which was really the impetus for the Food System Summit, which was already decided before the pandemic broke out that this would happen. And so all of this stuff has been going on in recent years with a lot of interest and concern about the global food security situation. And it's really the failure of the global community to really tackle hunger that has led to a growing conversation and interest in the role of science and knowledge in advising or informing policymaking for food security and nutrition, because clearly there's a sense that we're not bringing the right kinds of policies forward because we're not able to tackle these problems. So that's really what I want to address today, is this big question of how do we bring science and knowledge into the policymaking process to inform in ways that we need to move forward, because we all know from all ends of the political spectrum that a transformation of food systems is absolutely required. But at the same time, there's not always wide agreement on exactly how we go about doing that. So that's a bit of the challenge. And then my immediate challenge is which button I push to advance this. So there we go. So I've structured my remarks around three big questions. First, how can knowledge and science best support food security policy at the international level? Second, what is the experience of existing expert panels, such as the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, in trying to support international food security policy development? And third, what are the current challenges facing the global food security policy context? Now, these are big questions, and I'm going to try and keep my comments as brief as possible. Otherwise, I'll be here till tomorrow still talking about these issues. So first, we'll go to the first question. How can knowledge and science best support food security policy? So as I already mentioned in the introduction, we are seeing a rise in world hunger. This is a graphic from the latest SOFI report, which is the State of Food Security in the World report that the FAO puts out every year. And as you can see, the trend, hunger trend line, and even the percentage of the world's population, it's been going up in recent years. So that's really a big concern. And in the past, there was typically an assumption that if we just produce more food, people will be well fed and will address this hunger problem. But we know we now produce more food than ever. Yet we still are seeing a hunger crisis. So we know that policies need to go beyond that kind of production-focused approach or that technology-focused approach, and we need to tackle this problem. But beyond just simply rising hunger in the world, we're seeing huge issues across food systems. So we know, I already mentioned, there's over 800 million chronically undernourished people. At the same time, there's 2.37 billion people facing moderate or severe food insecurity. So that's like, if you're not familiar with the difference between these two terms, chronic undernourishment really means you're not getting enough calories to even lead a basic sedentary life continuously for a year. That's how many people are facing that level of hunger. But a bigger number are facing what we call moderate or severe food insecurity, which is a broader category. But also over 3 billion people can't afford a healthy diet. Nearly 2 billion people are overnourished, and 1.5 billion people are facing one or more forms of micronutrient deficiency. And across the food system, we've got these broader issues and problems. We have a very uneven quality of food environments, meaning not everybody has access to healthy foods at all times. There are increasingly precarious food system livelihoods, especially for small-scale producers, especially in developing countries. Food systems have crossed what people call scientists call the planetary boundaries of what is sustainable, and food systems have crossed several of those boundaries. And food systems are increasingly vulnerable to climate change, as we all know. And then COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine have really exacerbated these trends. So the food system is facing broadly a number of challenges. And this really brings into focus why we need science and knowledge to inform policy. But I first want to talk about some of the challenges of bringing science and knowledge into policymaking. And it's important here to pause and talk about the fact that food systems themselves serve multiple functions in society, and that those multiple functions actually make policymaking extremely complex, because there are a number of participants and stakeholders in food systems who have very different ideas of what food systems should be delivering. So we all know, these functions that food systems serve. Well, they all came in at once here, so I'll just talk about them. We know that food is a basic human need for survival. We know that access to adequate food is an internationally recognized human right. We know that food systems provide diverse types of livelihoods for around a third of humanity. They have a livelihood connected to food systems, although there's a huge diversity of livelihoods within food systems, from food system workers to small-scale producers to even large multinational corporations. They all are earning their livelihoods from food systems, but in very different ways. We know that food systems are deeply entrenched in ecosystems, and increasingly we're aware of the carbon emissions that arise from food systems, but also the damage that industrial agriculture has posed for biodiversity, water, etc. And we know that food is a cornerstone of cultural norms and practices all over the world and in different ways. And finally, food is obviously a market commodity. As we see more and more people living in cities, they're relying on markets primarily to buy food, but it's not just that it's a consumer product. It also is a commodity in the sense that food is increasingly seen as a financial asset, where financial actors are investing in food systems in different ways, or in commodity futures products as almost like a currency. So food is serving all kinds of functions for all different kinds of participants and stakeholders within food systems. But that is what, in a way, makes it so challenging to bring science and knowledge into the process, because there are different interests involved. And we know that there are vast power differentials within food systems, and some actors have more voice than others. So small-scale producers producing on marginalized lands who might be facing hunger, they have less voice within the policymaking process than large commercial interests do, for example. So in that sense, it's really important to make sure that science and knowledge that comes to bear on food policymaking is legitimate. It's viewed as legitimate by all participants in food systems. So that's the big challenge. And when I mentioned these different power dynamics within food systems, and some voices being louder than others, just to give a call out to a report that's about to come out this next week from IPES Food, which is another expert panel, non-governmental expert panel that I sit on, which is focused on countering the corporate capture of food systems governance. It's really pointing out that there are both visible ways in which big corporate actors engage in food governance and shape it through multi-stakeholder initiatives or public-private partnerships, et cetera. But they're also engaged in ways that are less visible, such as political donations and sponsoring research, and et cetera. So when you've got this kind of big set of powerful actors that have a big stake in what food system governance looks like, it's really important for science and knowledge to be aware of those powerful actors, how they operate, to make sure that science and policy carries that kind of legitimacy and balance that is accepted by all stakeholders. So that's where this question of legitimacy comes in, and I just want to to point out a paper that I was lead on came out a couple of weeks ago in Nature Food, where we identify the principles that are necessary to make science and knowledge for policymaking in the food space more legitimate. And to do that requires science and policy bodies, such as the high-level panel of experts that I sit on, or any other science policy body, need to have processes and procedures in place that ensure that the work that comes forward from those bodies is widely accepted and seen as legitimate. So that's what we call the I-TRACE principles. And I'm going to go into these a little bit more depth in the next slide. So that first, the I stands for independent. And it's really important that science policy bodies for food systems are clear that they're independent from the kind of interest groups in food systems, including states, but including, as I said, big, powerful actors. And they need to be sure that that independence allows them to serve the public interest, not any specific interests of any of those groups with different stakeholders, but really the public interest. And what is the public interest? I mean, we know we have these goals that are agreed, the 2030 agenda to end hunger, promote sustainable food systems. These are goals in the public interest, and the independence is really important of science policy to serve that public interest. And independence is also necessary to ensure a balanced assessment of evidence that comes from different sources. So that balance is very important. In a sense, it's requiring that assessment and not just necessarily giving equal time to, the voices of different players, but really assessing the evidence against the goals, the public interest goals. And the experts that are involved should be free from conflicts of interest. In other words, not coming from any one of those stakeholder groups and speaking for them, but really speaking on behalf of the public interest. So that's really important, is the independence of this kind of science and knowledge. It also needs to be transparent. And this means open processes where it's very clear how the science body, for example, operates and follows transparent processes, and also to acknowledge where debates and disagreements exist. So in other words, it's important that when we know that food systems serve so many different functions, there are bound to be differences of opinion about different kinds of policy ideas. It's important to acknowledge that those disagreements exist rather than trying to paper over them and assume that we're always going to agree on everything, because it's very unlikely. I've been studying food systems for 30 years. There's a lot of disagreements. So it's important to acknowledge where those exist and should talk about pros and cons of different kinds of policy solutions. And also providing clarity on how different inputs are considered. And that's really important, rather than just saying, oh, we'll take all submissions and then coming out with some kind of policy advice. It's important to actually be accountable. A science policy body has to say how that advice was taken into consideration and whether it was taken up or not and why. So again, that kind of transparency is really important. It also needs to be accessible. I mean, we know that scientists can often speak in jargon and in tongues that people, average people don't understand. Policymakers need to have information readily accessible and available that is not going to require them to go and take a university course just to understand what the policy advice is. It needs to be clear. And so this, again, is really important for legitimacy, because it helps to make clear what the assumptions are behind policy advice and how it might be implemented and what are the expected outcomes. That kind of accessibility is very, very important to draw those clear linkages. And also the information that goes into these assessments needs to be adhering to the principles of open and fair access. And there's a big movement now about data openness and data access, just to make sure that everyone has access to the information and can assess it on their own. And that provides, again, it builds legitimacy through the processes of science policy for food systems. And this is a big one, is the C, is the consultative. It's extremely important for any science advice that goes into policymaking to consult with experts from a range of sources. And I use the words knowledge and expertise explicitly rather than science, because there are a lot of experts in food systems who are not quote unquote scientists, right? Farmers, producers, food system workers, they all have expertise from where they sit within food systems, and their knowledge and information is extremely important for policymakers to understand. And they're also knowledge holders, indigenous peoples. We know that we need to understand traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and it's very important for food systems, and it needs to be brought into the process. So while you can study academic papers that are published in scientific journals, you need to supplement that and really bring it together with expertise coming from other knowledge holders. And that's really important. And also, it's important to consult with those who are most affected by hunger and undernutrition, because we need to understand, those are the participants in food systems who are often having the least voice, as I mentioned. So we need to understand their lived experience and bring it into understandings of how food systems work and what kinds of policies can lead to improvements. Because it's not that helpful just to have this scientific understanding without any connection to the on-the-ground experiences of people, because then you risk making policy advice that bears no relationship to their outcomes and their lived experience. So that's really important, is to have that consultative process. And I would say that actually adds a lot of time and effort into science policymaking, but it's extremely important to include. And then finally, obviously, evidence-based, like science and knowledge that advises for policy needs to be based on evidence. I've already mentioned the importance of lived experience, but also I would say the range of scientific evidence coming from a range of disciplines. So what's really interesting and unique about food systems is how many different disciplines are probably represented even in this room and in the KSLA, from economics to agrarian studies, to agronomy, to nutrition, geography, sociology. There's so many disciplines, political science, that all of us are studying in a way, interdisciplinary way, and have to interact with each other. And I really think that it's important that the science and knowledge for policymaking tap into all of these different disciplines and all of these different communities. But even there's opportunity, and there's lots of disagreement, coming from different academic camps about what is the best way forward. An economist might say, oh, it's an economic problem, right? And a nutritionist might say, it's a food quality problem. And so it's really important to bring in all those voices and understand how to bring them together in a way that makes for coherent policy advice. And so it's obviously a very complex process, but if we don't bring in all of these elements into that process, there's a risk that scientific advice or science and knowledge advice lacks legitimacy. And that's the last thing we want, because if you've got a policy that just sort of gets railroaded through really quickly without going through these kinds of consultative processes, there could be a lot of people who are very skeptical of it, and that can obviously cause problems, and the policy itself might cause problems because it wasn't consulting with those who are most affected. So these principles are very, very important to ensure legitimacy of the advice and the soundness of the advice. So I want to shift now to talk a little bit about the experience of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, which is the science policy body of the Committee on World Food Security. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ecosystem of the UN Committee on World Food Security, but it's a UN body. It's been around since the 1970s. And at the moment, it has both member governments as well as non-governmental participants in the process. That includes civil society and the private sector in a kind of process that's trying to build international policy consensus and policy products to coordinate on food security issues at the international level. And so the high-level panel of experts is an expert body that advises this UN committee. Now I'm going to show a slide that's really complicated and you probably can't read it, as but but I'm going to zoom in on parts of this. But I wanted to share this because when I joined the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition several years ago, I was trying to wrap my head around how do all these different things that I hear about relate to each other. And so the things in green are the Committee on World Food Security. The things in blue are the processes of the high-level panel of experts. The things in yellow are sort of the Rome-based agencies. That's the FAO, the World Food Program, and the IFAD. The thing in orange, that's the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. And the purple box, that's like the UN system. So all of these elements are part of the food security governance process in the UN level, but they all have their different roles and functions. And I want to zoom in a little bit on both the CFS and the high-level panels, just to explain how they work and what they do in trying to build policy convergence around food security issues at the international level. So this is the CFS, what it sort of looks like, at least in my head. And its aim is to, as I said, build policy coordination. So it negotiates guidelines and other policy products, often based on high-level panel of expert reports. It adopts policy recommendations, and it does a periodic review of the implementation of the policy recommendations and guidelines. And that's sort of its function, is to meet regularly. It meets in October every year for the annual plenary, and meets the Bureau and Advisory meets periodically throughout the year to discuss food security issues. And the committee itself, as I mentioned, it was established in the 1970s, and it has these what's unique about it in the UN system is it has these mechanisms that allow for participation from civil society and indigenous peoples, so they have their own mechanism, and private sector has its own mechanism, and the governments themselves are the voting members. So the CSIPM and the PSM are allowed to sort of be at the meetings, they're allowed to speak, they have inputs into the process, but they don't vote. States are the ones who vote because it's this UN body, but it's unique in that it allows this non-state participation, and that's recognition that there's expertise and knowledge that's coming from these other constituencies. It's not, and it ensures that this body isn't just about state interests, but I'm going to come back to that point because state interests certainly come into the process. And the reform of the CFS, there was a big reform in 2009 after the 2008 food crisis, where there was maybe a sense that the CFS, which was established actually out of the 1970s food crisis, there was this idea that we need this policy coordination mechanism. It was set up at that first World Food Conference, but it didn't have civil society and private sector participation at that time. And it was kind of criticized as a bit of a talk shop. There was actually some concern about the CFS, and maybe it should even be shut down because governments would talk past each other and they would talk, and nothing would really happen. And so there was a big reform in 2009 after the last food crisis, really trying to sort of jolt this body back into working in a more constructive way. And it was really successful in that sense of bringing in civil society and the private sector into a more robust conversation. I think the CFS has really gained a lot of legitimacy by doing that, and people feel good about its products, but of course some challenges remain, and I'll come back to that. But in 2009, the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition was created as part of this reform process, really to make sure that an evidence-based, science and knowledge-based set of advice was coming to members of the CFS, so that it wasn't just a talk shop about interests, that it actually had substance coming from the scientific and knowledge communities to inform what happens in that space. So that was exciting that the high-level panel of experts in food security and nutrition was formulated at that time, and made sense because other bodies were also, we all know about the IPCC, right? It's a scientific body that provides advice to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the IPBES, which was also coming into place around, I can't remember what year it actually came into being, but sometime in the last decade, bringing advice forward on biodiversity issues, just for example. So the HLPE is kind of in that vein. So this is a slight, as much as I could zoom in on the HLPE and what it does, but I just wanted to sort of flag some key aspects. So I already mentioned when it was set up, the HLP, it really tries to provide that independent evidence-based policy Its secretariat is hosted at the FAO, and it really strives to provide this kind of expert advice, and does so through what we call the steering committee. So there's a 15-member panel of the steering committee, and the steering committee, though, is not the whole HLP. It's not like there's only 15 people on this high-level panel. It's just the steering committee, and it makes sure that reports are regularly undertaken in consultation with the CFS. It works on the policy recommendations, addressing critical issues like COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine, this sort of thing. And then what's interesting is that its substantive reports are actually written by what we call project teams for HLPE reports. So it's not that, we're doing a report right now on inequalities. And it's not that the 15 people on the panel are writing that report. We find experts from all over the world who are experts specifically in inequality, and they get together and work on the report. And then they work with the steering committee to produce the final report. So it sort of brings in these additional experts who are part of that expert panel. And of course, the project teams are drawing on a range of data sources that come from, the vast troves of statistical knowledge and information that the FAO and other Rome-based agencies produced, as well as other kinds of expert bodies drawing on the latest scientific and scholarly studies, and also inputs from open consultations with stakeholders. And it follows these really important review processes as well. This is, again, important for legitimacy. It goes through extensive peer review, all of the reports, but also a really important part of these open and transparent consultation processes. So all the reports at all the stages, the V0 draft, the V1 draft, the V2 draft, it's being reviewed. And at that V1 draft is where we really have the open and transparent consultation with, we've got a roster of over 1,200 experts and other kinds of participants, Indigenous knowledge holders and farmer communities and organizations that provide in-depth, detailed advice and inputs into all the reports. So it's really a consultative process. So I want to stress about the iTrace principles that I've already mentioned. HLP is very independent, although it still is quite tethered to the CFS. It's transparent in terms of its processes. It's accessible, consultative, and evidence-based. So it meets these kinds of criteria, but of course there are always ways that it can be improved. But these are the processes, but also equally important is the content. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that HLPE has done. And recently, for example, we did a big report in 2020, kind of looking at why the global community is not meeting SDG 2, and we produced the report, Food Security and Nutrition, Building a Global Narrative Towards 2030. This was a request from the Committee on World Food Security to do a big picture look at the progress that's happening and what can policy and scientific advice bring forward. And one of the main recommendations of this report was to widen the way we view food security. Traditionally, the last few decades, we've talked about 4 pillars of food security. You're probably familiar with them, being availability, access, utilization, and stability. These have been sort of the standard dimensions of food security that we've talked about, and they've really informed policy in important ways. So availability obviously means that there's enough food. Access means people are able to access it. So it's, there could be food in the community, but people don't have money to buy it. So you need to make sure there's access. Utilization is referring to the nutritional component, that the human body is able to take that food and metabolize it properly. And stability, meaning that global markets are not, volatile, et cetera. And so what this report advised is that we need to move to a wider framework. I can get this to move, which we call the 6 dimensions of food security. So here we added sustainability and agency. And what we're referring to here, obviously by sustainability, there's a growing recognition that we're not going to have food security and nutrition into the future unless it's sustainable today and sustainable into the future. And so in that sense, sustainability needs to be internalized into our understanding of food security itself. And that's extremely important. And we know that we're often talking about, how food systems need to be sustainable. That's a big reason why we're pushing this transformative agenda. So sustainability is essential. And now agency is another element that we really recommended be brought in. And sometimes people are confused what we need by agency. Agency is simply referring to people's voice and ability to participate in food systems on their own terms. So it's really trying to recognize that there are a lot of people who might be poor, underrepresented in their communities. They might be marginalized within food systems. They need to have more of a say in how food systems operate and also how they're governed. And that kind of agency can really help ensure better food security and nutrition in the long run. And all of these dimensions are interrelated with one another. And this, just to say, this idea is not necessarily it's not embraced by all of CFS. CFS did not pass a policy recommendation saying, yeah, good idea. Some states are really excited about it. Others are a little more skeptical for various reasons. But what's interesting to us is that since we published this report, the FAO is now using this in their state of food insecurity reports every year, and they're finding this a useful framework. It's also been picked up in lots of academic research studies. So perhaps it will one day be embraced by the CFS membership. We will see. And another substantive recommendation out of this report was the need to shift policy along a number of axes to better address food security and nutrition problems. One being moving from just a focus on supply, as I mentioned, to more of a radical transformation of food systems as a whole. And that's really embracing those 6 dimensions. Moving away from seeing food security and nutrition as just being a sectoral issue. It's not just an agricultural issue or just even a food system issue. Food systems are interconnected with ecological systems, economic systems, health systems. I mean, the pandemic really made this evident, and we're really trying to widen that agenda to really see how these interconnections happen. Also, a move from just focusing on hunger and undernutrition to understanding the complex dynamics of malnutrition in all its forms and the interrelationships. And also, increasingly, we need to understand that there's not going to be one solution to the global hunger problem. It needs to be context-specific policies that happen on the ground in different places to take into account different contexts. There are lots of countries in the world, for example, facing complex conflicts and crises that have to think about food policies in a different way from countries that might not be facing those circumstances. And so we need to have diverse policies. So that's some of the substantive advice coming out of the high-level panel. And also just to briefly mention, some examples of the way in which the reports coming out of the HLPE inform Committee on World Food Security outputs. So for example, the HLP did a big report in 2017 on nutrition and food systems that resulted in a voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition just this past year. So the policy process can take a long time, lots of negotiations that go on among governments, but behind it is usually a high-level panel of experts report. Same with agroecology. There's now policy recommendations coming out of the CFS this past year on agroecology and implementing agroecology. And that was supported by an HLPE report on agroecology, which was really important in establishing the 13 principles of agroecology that are now widely recognized in lots of different scientific reports. So these are just some examples of the ways in which the science policy body then informs international food policies. Okay, I'm coming to the final section of what I wanted to talk about, which were some of the current challenges facing global food security and the policy context in particular at this moment. This is a picture from CFS 50, which was Rome in October. And you can see the CFS chair on the screen here, Gabriel Ferraro di Loma, and he's looking a little frustrated, partly because the conversations are a little bit frustrating. And I'll explain a little bit why they're a little bit frustrating. Let me find myself in my notes here. Okay, so I just want to stress that just because you've got, we might have a science policy body and it might have really good processes to ensure the legitimacy of the advice, and they might bring really good content forward to consider on improving food security policies, but it doesn't mean that governments are necessarily going to listen. right? I mean, it's a basic political point, but it's important to recognize. And I say that because there's been some critique of the science policy space right now, some critique even of the HLPE because the CFS looks maybe weak in the face of big crises. It's not making decisions. But that I would say it's not necessarily the fault of the science. It's about politics. And the same thing is happening in the space of climate change. So we know, there's the big COP27, but a lot of the ambition fell short of what the scientists were hoping for in that context. Same with a CBD Conference on Biodiversity that happened in Montreal in December. There was a lot of critique that governments were making only small commitments rather than the big ones that were coming from the science bodies that they wanted to see big changes. The same thing is going on here in the space of food security. So what is that, what is the source of that? Well, I would say state interests and geopolitics still matter a lot. I would say that at this moment, the war in Ukraine has really complicated international food policy coordination. I mean, the pandemic, it was bad enough. There was a lot of push for coordinated policies in the wake of the pandemic, still going on. But even there, it was difficult to get governments to agree on a specific set of measures to respond to the pandemic. Getting them to agree on a specific set of measures responding to the supply chain disruptions caused by the war is even more difficult. And so the tensions that we're seeing geopolitically more broadly in the world about the war in Ukraine are really mirrored within the CFS itself. And that led to some really, I would say difficult conversations that happened in the CFS, even the deliberations. The first day of the CFS meeting, so that's a plenary that usually lasts 4 days in Rome in October. The first day is usually really straightforward, where you've got high-level policymakers coming and talking about the latest FAO reports and hunger numbers, and then then they can move on to the other business, but they acknowledge that there's a bad situation. Well, this day of discussion was difficult, but CFS couldn't even agree on the fourth day how to summarize the conversation. That's how difficult the conversation was. So they had to reconvene in December virtually just to agree on language of how they summarized what the discussion was. So you can imagine what the discussion was, but I'll tell you in a nutshell. You had some governments, obviously Ukraine, the EU, US, saying that the main reason we're seeing a spike in hunger right now is because of the war in Ukraine and the disrupted supply chains. That's what's the main problem right now. And then on the other hand, you've got Russia, Belarus, and some other countries saying, no, it's sanctions. Sanctions is the biggest problem. It's not the war. It's the fact that the West has put sanctions in place. And this sort of went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's why they couldn't agree on the language, because some parties wanted the word sanctions to be in the agreed text and others did not. And in fact, when they reconvened in December, first time ever, CFS actually had to do a roll call vote on this issue. And of course, Russia and Belarus didn't win that, but I think they got a footnote in the end. But it was just like one of these processes where it was kind of tedious and frustrating to watch, because the substantive issues about hunger and undernutrition, and even some of the big structural issues of why, what is wrong with food systems right now and why is it so difficult to tackle hunger, those weren't even discussed. It just sort of devolved into this geopolitical discussion, and that was rather frustrating. And in the midst of this, the high-level panel of experts, I've got up here the cover of a report we were able to produce in April about the immediate impact of the war on hunger and nutrition in the world. But we were not able to update that or move forward with it because of that deadlock within the CFS. And we respond to requests from the CFS. So they did not request an update from us. So that report's there. It's a really good report. We wish we could update it. I mean, and I've had the privilege to be able to work through other expert groups like the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems to analyze the impacts of the war. And so those reports came out in May and June, and done a lot of media interviews, et cetera, to sort of get that analysis out, but not through these official channels. So I would say that's a huge issue and a challenge. Another thing I wanted to bring up is the UN Food Systems Summit, which took place in 2021, but there was a lot of process the year before, a lot of consultations online. because it was during the pandemic, it was kind of weird that a lot of this stuff was virtually occurring. But it also caused a lot of confusion around, well, which bodies in the UN are most responsible for dealing with food security and nutrition anyway? There was a big sense, especially among civil society, that the CFS was being sort of sidestepped, and that suddenly we had this new food system summit process. A big contingent of civil society walked out and boycotted the summit because they were worried that it was over representing corporations and not truly engaging with the civil society and social movements that they felt that they represented. And so it created this big fissure and confusion. And in the midst of this, there was also this push from some in the scientific group of the summit, because they had their own science group, proliferation of these science groups, that were calling for a new science policy body, which they called an IPCC for food, but they weren't always acknowledging the existence of the HLPE, and that might have been critique of the CFS process. We're not really sure, but it created a lot of confusion and a lot of debate at the time. And so that, I think, is a challenge, because there's still this discussion going on about the role of the summit, et cetera. But in the next slide, I'll show that one of the things that came out of that summit was an acknowledgement that we don't need to create any new institutions. We have a lot of institutions. We have the FAO and IFAD and the World Food Program, it's CFS, but let's coordinate better among them. And bringing in other institutions like UNEP and UNDP, et cetera, into the process. And so there was a creation of what's called now the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Their website launched a couple of weeks ago, even though it officially existed as of January 1st, 2022. And this new hub has also established a new scientific advisory committee that is bringing in members of the HLPE FSN, as well as members from the UN Food System Summit Scientific Group, as well as some other scientists. And it's a group of 33 scientists advising governments on moving forward. But the work hasn't commenced yet. And so I can't say a lot about what the process is going to look like, because I only just got the letter 2 days ago telling me the first meeting is going to happen virtually in February. But it's certainly an interesting time that, these kinds of things are moving and happening, but we have yet to see if it's going to result in any substantively different kinds of advice, and also, as I said, just because advice might be sound and legitimate doesn't mean that governments are going to pick it up again. And part of that has, as I said, interest, and it's not just those geopolitics I talked about. Underlying all of that too are obviously trade interests, right? So some governments are really focused on grain exports, for example. Others might be, dependent on food imports, and the trade issue is really, really important as well as an undercurrent within the politics of these kinds of food security policymaking bodies. And then in the meantime, just quickly state, there's been some movement towards collaboration, or at least cooperation, amongst different science policy bodies that touch on food security issues. So obviously I've talked a lot about the HLPE FSN, but the IPBES, which is the International Panel on Biodiversity, is it Ecosystem Services? I should know this off the top of my head. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We've had initial discussions between the leadership of these different bodies. And it's interesting, if you take some specific issues like agroecology, like all three of these bodies have made recommendations about the importance of agroecology for protecting biodiversity, for addressing climate change, and for food security. So there are areas where there's potential for policy convergence advice, but the uptake among governments has been much more patchy, let's say. So quickly summing up, just to say, I think there's really diverse roles and power differentials in food systems that require us to design science, policy, and society interfaces in ways that ensure legitimacy. And I would say the HLPE does have unique legitimacy because it follows a lot of those key principles that feed into the policy convergence process, but challenges obviously remain in these spaces. And as I said, design of these bodies matters, but so do interests and geopolitics. So with that, I'm sorry if I spoke for too long, but I will say thank you for listening. I look forward to this.